wrongly. In this 15-minute presentation, author, psychotherapist, and hashtag NFGM activist Farzana Doctor will talk about her experiences of activism, healing, and her sex and relationships column for survivors. Dear Maasi? Maasi, sorry. Yes, take it away. And remember to describe how you look like.
Yes, thank you. So thank you everybody for being here. So what do I look like? I'm a South Asian woman originally from India. So I have brown skin. I have a little bit of a fountain at the top of my head because I've pulled my hair up. I'm 50 years old. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything else I can say. I'm not used to describing myself. This is such a good exercise. I'm gonna share my screen because I want to make sure I stay organized. Oh, my slides aren't showing up when I try to share. Let me just try this again.
Okay, try again. I needed to make you host.
Okay, cool. And there it is. Wonderful.
Okay, I see it now.
You can see it? Okay, so now I need to just do slideshow, right?
Yes.
Cool. Everyone can see that?
Yes,
Awesome.
all good.
Okay, great. So I just want to talk a little bit about where I come from as I talk about this issue. So I'm a survivor of Khatna, which is the word that we use in our community, in the Dawoodi Bohra community that I'm from. Dawoodi Bohras are a subsect of Shia Muslims and originating probably first from Yemen, but now in India and across the diaspora, across the world. We're a fairly insular kind of community, so many people haven't heard about us. I'm also an activist. I've been involved in these issues for about 6 years now. And I'm a psychotherapist. I do that in the afternoon, and in the morning I'm a novelist. And I've been doing a lot of talking about this issue in the last while because the latest book that I wrote is a book about one character and how she deals with Khatna. So I like to put this slide up because I'm going to be talking about sexual violence, and I'm going to be sharing some information about what exactly is FGM, and a lot of people don't know. So, you know, whenever people feel triggered, you know, it's always good to get grounded. Sometimes trigger warnings make people brace and tighten everything up, including, you know, getting like, I Kegel basically is what I do. So try not to do that. Instead, plant your feet and breathe and just notice and, you know, generally take care of yourself. So what is FGMC? So female genital mutilation / cutting. And these terms are used interchangeably. And generally activists will use both terms because we want to include people who prefer mutilation or who prefer the term cutting. We want to make sure that people feel that they are part of this. So it's all procedures where there's partial or total removal of female external genitalia or other injury to the female genital organs for non-medical reasons. That's the UNICEF term. It's generally happening to minors and it happens without consent. There's 4 main types. However, there's no standardization because this happens mostly by amateur cutters. It is happening medically in some places too, but it often happens under duress. And so that's also where standardization can't happen, right? Because if somebody is kicking and screaming, it's going to be a different thing than if somebody is still. And in every community, there's a different word. So in my community, we say cuffs, we say Khatna. You know, I know some of you are from Singapore, so I've also put the term for Singapore and in Indonesia and Malaysia. This is, if we had standardization, this is what it would look like. But remember, there's no standardization. So there's type 1, which refers to cutting the clitoral hood and or the clitoris. In my community, the focus is on the clitoral hood, But of course, you know, the space between the clitoral hood and the clitoris, especially on somebody who's really small, is very like minuscule. And so often there can be damage to the external part of the clitoris. Type 2 involves, can involve type 1 plus partial or total removal of the labia minora. And type 3 is often what happens in type 1 plus type 2, and then also a kind of narrowing and covering of the vaginal opening and fusing the labia together. And then type 4 is kind of like every other non-medical harmful thing that can happen. And we're learning about more and more types of type 4 because there has been this kind of Me Too movement that's been happening in the last, I would say, 5 years or so, where more people across the whole globe are talking about all of the various forms of FGM. So here's what we know so far. And remember that this is a very silenced, taboo subject. So there's lots of things we don't know. It happens in 92 countries and counting. The belief is that it happens to somebody who was assigned female at birth every 10 seconds. And based on statistics from 32 countries, at least 200 million are affected. And these are some myths I just like to bust. So this is not really about religion. Most religious leaders oppose it. Of course, there are fringy religious people who say that it's required. And in my own community, our religious head says it's required. This is not about culture. You know, sometimes people who are the proponents of maintaining these practices will say, it's our culture, we are allowed to do it. But we actually think of it as a social norm. And we have so many social norms that have changed over time. And really, if it's about culture, it's about patriarchy. And it happens across religious and cultural groups all around the world. So I'll tell you just a little bit more about how it happens in my community. So as I mentioned before, small insular Muslim community. This is a picture of me and my sister and one of our aunts wearing a rida, which is like the traditional dress that you would wear if you're going to a mosque. Some more Orthodox women, though, wear it all the time in public. And we're standing in front of a mosque that my great-great-grandfather built for his mother. And I always like to show this photo because religious practices are very fluid. So, you know, here I am, you know, not wearing religious garb, but I have had these moments where I also practice. And, you know, we come from a community that is very generous, very beautiful. Many of us are like there's been a lot of focus, at least, you know, in the history of our community. It's changing a little bit lately, but there's an emphasis on education of women. Like this is a beautiful community, and it also has this very harmful practice. So how it's practiced in our community is that around the age of 7, plus or minus a few years, for me it happened when I was 4, that's when it is done to a girl. And it's done because of the belief that it can control sexuality. And across the globe, this is why it's done. There's a belief that female sexuality must be controlled. And this is a way to somehow control it. And we have a religious head who insists that it must be done, and he is quite loved. And there's also a community dynamic in which you're not allowed to question anything, and if you question, you can be shunned. And within a community where there's a lot of interdependency, the community shunning can be quite harmful. You know, if you have a business in the community, and this has actually happened, someone can have a business in the community, their daughter might be speaking up about this on Facebook, that father who maybe owns the business will get a visit and be told, if she doesn't stay quiet, we will boycott your business. So that's an important community dynamic to notice. And most of the people who practice Khatna believe that it's harmless, like no sex education, right? So they believe that it's harmless, that it's just a normal thing. It's been happening intergenerationally for thousands of years. So like, what's the big deal is what they would say. And it's only been in the last 5-6 years that this has even entered into kind of mainstream discussion. Before that, nobody talked about it. Within families, you could have had it done within a family and nobody would have talked about it. You could have gone with your cousin. You and your cousin will never talk about it because, and this is my experience, when it's done, it's incredibly confusing and painful. You're usually told that you're going for ice cream or to a party. So then, and you're taken by a family member to an amateur cutter or to a clinic. You don't know what's going on. And what you're told is nothing happened. Why are you crying? So gaslighting. And don't talk about this. You're not allowed to talk about this. And so there can be a lot of silence. And a lot of people will even suppress the memory. And if you are then a grown-up who has suppressed the memory, and then maybe your mother-in-law or somebody says, it's time to take your child, you're going to be in a bit of a state of a fog, perhaps, right? And in my case, how it worked, because I have a family that is quite, I would say, not very religious, and that's part of, I think, how it happened, is that when, we're a collectivist culture. And so, a parent might say, we're not going to do this to our child, but other relatives and elders will say, we know better. And we're going to save this child and we're going to take care of this child. And this is how they would do it. So in my case, it happened without my parents knowing. I never told them. It was never discussed, all of that. So that's a little bit about how it happens. And of course, it's not harmless. Of course, it's not. So here's a couple of studies. In this one study, and I encourage people to go look up wespeakout.org. It's the organization I've been working with. 33% believe it has negatively impacted their sex life. And of course it does, right? It's like any form of sexual trauma. And so these are some of the things that people said: low sex drive, inability to feel sexual pleasure. Sometimes there's oversensitivity in the clitoral area. So the thing you said, Oliver, earlier about that glass, broken glass, sometimes people can feel an oversensitivity and even pain. And, we know that the clitoris is this multi, I'm making, like, it's got many parts, and it's got, branches, right? And we know that nerves work in this very interesting way. So if you did have some damage to the external part, you can feel pain in other parts too, right? Further down the branch. SAYO is our sister organization. They've also done a study. 32% said they didn't even know if it impacted their sex life. And so that speaks to a lack of sex ed, right? Like, what do you compare it against? And 35% said they didn't even exactly know what exactly had been cut. So, maybe they've never looked at themselves in the mirror. Maybe they have never been encouraged to understand what genitalia can look like. And, of course, we know that female genitalia can look like. There's so much diversity, right, in what things look like. Oh. Oops, sorry. And if you're interested, go to these websites and you can find out more. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what has helped me in my own healing. So mindfulness has been really helpful. So I really like the idea of, slow sexuality. What I was able to do through learning mindfulness in my sexuality was that I could stop, I could pause if I got overwhelmed, if I felt unsafe, if my limbic system was detecting something, if I was in a state of suddenly feeling very small and young, pausing, waiting. This was something that I learned from a therapist, but Stacey Haynes has a great book on this. And then I had to teach my partner. And at first, I was struck by what Kat said. Initially when you're figuring out these things, it's not pretty. Everybody cries, everybody overreacts, everybody gets scared, right? But we learned to just be like very neutral about the pausing, like, okay, yeah, we're going to take a breath. And then we're going to wait. We're going to see if we want to continue. I've done different forms of therapy. You know, as a therapist, I'm in this very privileged position to be able to seek out different people, sometimes peers, and asking for a session or two if I know that they've got specific kinds of training. So somatic experiencing is one that I really love. Internal family systems therapy is great for working with the inner child. Janina Fisher's work has been really helpful. She, you know, talks about how the traumatized part often doesn't know that we have survived and still expects the trauma to happen again, you know. So think about how this works, you know. Perhaps you're lying down and you're in a very similar kind of body position as when the original trauma happened, right? So the traumatized part of us thinks, let's be on guard, let's brace, let's, you know, dissociate, let's, you know, all of that kind of stuff. So that was very helpful to me, because sometimes, you know, there can be this notion of like, well, it happened, you know, 45 years ago, like, what's wrong with you? But no, our body doesn't know. I needed to do some work around spirituality. You know, what does it mean to be part of a community that is so beautiful in so many ways, but also does this? So also looking at ancestral wounds. I did some work with somebody who is like a kind of like a psychic therapist, looking at how could we also heal previous generations. And then, you know, my ongoing activism has put me into contact with so many fabulous feminists, and we talk a lot, and that really helps. And then writing, you know, writing 7, which is the novel that is about Khatna, has really helped me, I think, in creating narrative where I didn't have narrative. I also began to understand more fully the perspectives of the people who believe in this practice. Lots of peer support has helped me. And then ongoing sex education, you know, as a therapist, I thought that I was pretty good in this area. I thought, oh yeah, I'm good around sex education. But the more podcasts I listen to, the more I, you know, come into spaces like this, I'm like, huh, wow, I'm having this realization that I still have this myth in my head, you know, or that belief. So ongoing sex education is so liberatory. Here's what didn't work for me. Shock and disbelief and pity. There's so much about that, you know, and I understand it. When I first started learning about FGM, I would be in a state of shock most of the time. But, you know, it's just another form of sexual trauma. Racist assumptions about culture and religion are so unhelpful. So I've heard people say, oh, I know that story. How often, you know, Muslim men, blah, blah, blah. Like, it's just not helpful for people to say these kinds of things. It's, you know, racist. Often the words that get used to describe this practice are barbaric, backward, and primitive. And I understand why people say that. You know, again, it's shocking to think that these things still happen, but these words are quite alienating if you're a survivor. Untrained doctors. So, you know, very few doctors have been trained around FGM, and those who have been trained may have been trained more around type 2 and type 3. So they know how to recognize scarring that looks like that. But, you know, with type 1 and type 4, you might not have any scarring. You might have such a minor scar, for example. So with me, I have a very minor scar that one doctor saw, you know, under bright lights, and she was like, I have no idea how this would happen. This doesn't look like FGM to me. That's very invalidating, of course. Sometimes survivors have a lot of pressure to get involved in public speaking when they're not ready. And I think that's because there's not a lot of survivors speaking out, and those who do it often burn out very quickly because they haven't done their healing work, right? So that was something that didn't work for me until I was ready, you know, and I got myself ready. I just want to tell you about a couple of activist interventions. So I do this sex and relationship advice column. So if you know any survivors, please send them in the direction of this column. We want people to ask their questions, and we basically debunk a lot of myths and try to provide some sex education for FGM survivors. We do a lot of social media campaigns like this one, Be the One campaign, and this one is Be the Grandma Who Protects Her Grandchild. We've also got like other iterations of this, be the father, be the mother, be the aunt, all that kind of stuff. And these two women are my own grandmothers. The one on the right is still alive, and she gave her permission to be part of our campaign, which speaks to how change happens in a community. This woman had never heard about any opposition to this issue until a few years ago, and began to get educated and changed her mind about it. If you would like to be an ally, just keep learning. Help us to normalize conversations by breaking silence. You can take part in some events that happen globally. February 6th is the day where we all take part in campaigns. So, think about doing that in your own workplaces, at your schools, and your communities. And here are a couple of organizations you might want to follow. One is the group I've been part of. Another one is a Singapore-based one. And questions. And maybe I'll just stop share. So.
Yes, thank you, Farzana.
Mm-hmm.
So we are taking questions now. Thank you for your brave sharing. Actually, I have a question. I imagine there is a lot of resistance from your community and the work that you do. How are you coping, and how do you deal with it?
There is some resistance for sure. Again, because it's so taboo and so silenced, many people just will avoid the conversations. But we do have some very there are pro Khatna activists out there, and they behave very rudely and hostilely on social media. They troll us. So mostly we've just learned how to block those people. And I think how it really, where I get my strength is by having a community of activists, who we all buffer each other. Mostly the most difficult issue is that people just don't want to talk about it. Oh, and there's a question about, does it exist in Canada? Yes. So it happens across the world. And I just want to tell you about how in the US, until 1977, female circumcision was covered by health insurance plans. So these are white Christian women until 1977 who were subjected to this as a way to control their sexuality. And where we think it's happening in North America is in the diasporic communities. So it's all anecdotal. People will say, yes, I know a cutter and I know it's happening, but it's very hard to track down these people. It's illegal, but there's been never any enforcement. And just around the issue of progressiveness. So even in my own community, people could be so progressive, but still do this because they've never been taught that it's harmful. They just think, oh, it's part of our religion.
I wanted to.
We have a question from Madam Rouge. Do you know if there's a correlation between cultures that practice FGM and male circumcision? I.e., they only do it to women and never to men, or are these completely different things?
Thank you. Yeah, this question comes up a lot just around, how are these things related? So we know that male circumcision is also considered to be a social norm, right? Because people do it for religious reasons, but they also do it for non-religious reasons. Like they just, for example, they want, dads will be like, I want my son's penis to look like my penis. That's a social norm, right? And it's a completely unnecessary practice for men as well. And there's been more and more discussion about it's harmful for men too, although it's not talked about in the same way. And lots of men will say, I don't feel that way. It's the issues of bodily autonomy and lack of consent are the same for both practices. And I think there's a growing movement of men who are saying that this is a violation and this is abuse. So where the correlation between where it happens is probably across religious groups, but not completely, right? So for example, Jewish people will do it to the boys, but not to the girls. Some Muslims will do it to the men and not to the girls. Sometimes some Muslims will do it to the men and to the girls. So it's not really a correlation.
Yes, we had a question from Oliver. You wanted to say something?
Yeah, I don't know, I was just thinking, to what extent could there be like a legal way to stop this? Do you know what I mean? Because
Yes.
it's like, if there can be a UN convention against the use of torture
yes.
or something, can there be something like that that cuts across cultures? Yeah.
So globally, this is something that is considered to be a human rights abuse globally. So, you know, like the World Health Organization says that, UNICEF says that, the UN says that, and there is sort of this commitment that by 2030 we're supposed to abolish this practice. I don't know that it's going to happen in 9 years, but that's sort of the commitment that's out there. And I would say in a lot of countries it is illegal, and in some places there's enforcement. So Tanzania is a great example of this, where you know, the teachers talk about it in school, the police will follow up, there are safe houses, there's lots of education. It's still happening, but there are all kinds of interventions. In many countries, if there is a direct report, they will investigate it. So legal interventions are happening, but not enough. I think it's the social interventions that are really going to stop this practice, but it does need to be legal too.
And more of a comment, and I think it's perhaps so there's the FGM, right? But it's being rationalized, but there's a need to control women's sexuality. Why? Don't we just don't we
Such
want
a good
it,
question.
Don't we want it to blossom? You know, in my experience, that's what I want is for to see her in her full whatever. You know, how can it be justified that we need? Why do you even want to? It's even an oxymoron. How can you control sexuality, orgasm? The whole point is not to control it, isn't it? So I don't know how they got away with justifying this. It's ridiculous.
Well, you know, Oliver, you're probably somebody who is, you know, much more like evolved if you've thought about these issues. But if you think back, or any of us think back to before we got sex education, before we started thinking about these issues, we probably had very narrow ideas about what sexuality is supposed to be. And earlier in the chat, I said, you know, we all learned that it's transactional as well. And there are still communities, you know, that believe that virginity is a thing. You know, now, most of us are like, virginity is not a thing. But, you know, so there's all kinds of really outdated notions out there still about sexuality. So, yeah, that we somehow need to protect our girls by controlling their sexuality is still there.
By hurting them, it's wow.
Yes, by hurting. Although they would say we're not hurting, we're just doing this little cut, is what they would say.
But from what I've learned, the clitoris is the thing in the universe with the most number of nerve endings. So how can that be not painful?
Yes, it's absolutely painful. Yeah. And then when you think about type 2 and type 3, which are more extreme versions of damage and harm, you know, in those cases, it's a bit more obvious. We are actually trying to harm. In my community, they can rationalize and say, no big deal, it's so small. It's not. Again, as I mentioned, it can happen under duress, right? So it can be quite damaging. Yeah. Martha has said, our sexuality is powerful and people get scared of power. Yeah.
Can you say something or repeat about pleasure and FGM? survivors can still have pleasure. Should we call them survivors or victims? That's a question from Martha.
You know, it really depends on the person, right? So I think a lot of people I know like to be called a survivor. Some don't even want to identify as either victim or survivor. They just don't want to be even thinking of themselves in relation to this abuse. But yes, so sexuality. So some of the things that have come up in conversations and also in the Dear Maasi column is that, you know, because the clitoris is a multi-branch thing, even if you had damage to the external part, and you might not have, or it might have been minimal, still there are so many ways to access pleasure. And that stat that I put out there, that 33% said that it impacted their sexuality negatively. That's a whole lot of other people who don't feel that it did, who feel that their sexuality was not harmed, that they can still have a positive sexuality. So yeah, not necessarily. I know one survivor who is a type 3 survivor. So, you know, the most damage done to her, and she has a lot of scar tissue, and she just talks about how it's slow sexuality that she needs in order to start to feel safe in her body and have ownership in her body, and even to lubricate. And so, yes, of course, you can have pleasure. You might just need to approach it the way any sexual abuse survivor might have to approach it, through a lot of care and mindfulness. Is there rehabilitation?
Karen, yes.
So the question is there rehabilitation? So, you know, I would say trauma therapy, psychological trauma therapy is probably the biggest thing that people need to be doing. But let's say your clitoris was cut, the external part of your clitoris was cut. There is a form of surgery that basically helps to, I'm going to get the word wrong, but it helps to bring more of the internal part of the clitoris out. And so it's almost like a reconstruction. And people can also have a reconstruction to external parts of the vulva as well. This can be quite liberatory. People can feel so much better about their bodies as a result of it. And I think they need to do their psychological work for any of it to manifest the way they want.
Okay, Martha had a question earlier. What
yes, about medicalization. Yes,
to medical doctors who perform FGM, who say they better do it, otherwise it will be done in more dangerous ways elsewhere.
Yeah, and there are places where it's primarily done in a medicalized way, and I would say that's in Singapore, right? And that's in some parts of Indonesia, and then even in India, there are some doctors who believe this. So, you know, what I would say to those doctors is you know, you took an oath to do no harm, and you have power and authority, and you could be using that power and authority to say to a parent, don't do this. This is why you don't do this. I will report you if you do this. You could go to jail. So I think that's how they need to do it. And yeah, I think these are probably doctors who don't have enough sex education themselves, who think that this is somehow okay. Yeah, and some people also think it's more okay to do it to newborns than to do it to small children, because they won't remember. But, you know, the body holds the trauma. And this also speaks to male circumcision. I think the body of, you know, baby boys, they hold the trauma too in their bodies. Yes, there's Kat said, when the mind forgets, the body will certainly remember. The body remembers. The body doesn't know how old we are.
The body keeps the score. That's that book, right?
Yes.
That's a great book. Yeah.
Bessel van der Kolk. Yeah.
Van der Kolk. Yeah, it's a very helpful book.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, do we have any more questions?
Just a comment. I hope this is one of those things like slavery and all the stupid things we've thought over history that we somehow let go, you know? Like resistance to same-sex marriage. It's, you know, hopefully, yeah. So maybe, yeah. Yeah, no one talks about it. You're right. Actually, I haven't talked about it with anyone apart from now. It's weird, right? Yeah.
And the more we talk about it, the more we're able to change this. Yeah. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Okay, if we have no questions, then I think we can move on. But before that, thank you so much, Farzana, for sharing something that is so personal as well. I think the three presenters today have shared very personal stories with us. And personally, I feel inspired by their bravery and also their ability to bring their vulnerability here today. Yeah, so